The price of truth, a midnight escape. Darkness cannot hide secrets. And this time, the hunter is the hunted. A moonless night, a desolate road, the roar of an engine shattering the silence, a shadow speeding like a storm. Natalie Hayes. Once a brilliant FBI agent, now just a name on a most wanted list. Betrayed. Hunted. But Natalie isn't afraid. She's not running out of desperation. She's running because she knows what's coming. Sirens wail behind her. Red and blue lights flash, reflecting off the mist-covered road. A patrol car in pursuit, trying to force her to the side. But they don't know. Natalie isn't an easy catch. She leans in, turns the wheel with perfect precision, gliding through a narrow curve as if the darkness itself is on her side. Her pursuers are just pawns, controlled by a hand far more terrifying than they can imagine. And Natalie knows exactly who that is. Then suddenly, a massive black SUV blocks the road. Blinding headlights turn everything into a blur, but she doesn't need to see to know who's stepping out. Logan Barnes, a name that once shook the police force. Not for justice, but for fear. A predator wearing the mask of law. A man willing to erase anyone who dares to stand against him. Natalie Hayes. Barnes speaks, his voice cold as steel. Game over. But he's wrong. Because if this is a game, Natalie was never a piece on the board. She's the one flipping the table. So what truth is being buried? Who is Natalie really? And most importantly, if Barnes is just a pawn in this rotten system, who's pulling the strings? If you want to know what happens next, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this story has only just begun. Midnight Chase. The night was silent, still as a black and white painting, broken only by the roaring engine of a motorcycle slicing through the darkness like a phantom. The empty road stretched endlessly, devoid of life, except for the flickering red and blue lights from a police cruiser reflecting off the pavement, pulsing with each rapid turn of the speeding bike. Behind it, a patrol car tore through the silence, sirens wailing, desperately trying to close the gap. But the motorcycle, defiant against the relentless pursuit, raced like the wind, weaving through the curves, slipping effortlessly beyond the reach of the searchlights. The rider? None other than Natalie Hayes. Once a celebrated FBI agent, now a ghost lost in the corridors of power, cast out after an internal case turned murky. But unlike most fugitives, there was no fear in her eyes. No panic. No desperation. Instead, her gaze was razor-sharp, steady as steel, betraying no emotion. She wasn't just running. She was waiting. The wind whipped through her long hair, its force carving invisible lines against her skin, highlighting the determination in her expression. She never looked back. She didn't need to. Everything was going according to plan, a plan only she understood. A plan so carefully constructed that even those chasing her had no idea what they were walking into. What was she waiting for? The sirens behind her grew distant, the flashing lights growing fainter. As she approached a sharp turn, she leaned in, executing a flawless maneuver that sent the pursuing vehicle struggling to keep up. A startled shout echoed from behind, but Natalie remained unfazed. Every move, every second was calculated. She was in control. The lonely road stretched ahead, her motorcycle carving sleek, fleeting streaks of light across the dark asphalt. Behind her, the patrol cars were nothing more than fading ghosts in the night. Natalie never turned around, but she knew the endgame was near. Something was coming. A signal, a shift, the moment that would change everything. Then it happened. A shadow emerged from the darkness, blocking her path, a massive black SUV with blinding headlights, appearing as if conjured from the abyss itself. Natalie didn't swerve. She didn't need to. She recognized that vehicle. This wasn't just another patrol car. This was something worse. Stepping out from the SUV was Logan Barnes, a name feared across law enforcement circles. Not for his heroism, but for his ruthlessness. A man whispered about in backrooms, whose power remained unchallenged despite the countless accusations of brutality and corruption trailing him like a storm cloud. Tonight, He wasn't here for justice. He was here to remind the world who was in charge. Natalie brought her motorcycle to a halt. Barnes moved forward, tall, imposing, his sharp eyes cutting through the night like blades. "Off the bike," he ordered, his voice devoid of warmth, a command rather than a request. There was no legal justification for this arrest. No warrant. No real charge. But Natalie, knowing full well the game at play, remained unervingly calm. She didn't rush, didn't resist. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable, her presence unwavering, as if this moment had been expected all along. Barnes stepped closer, his hand twitching, then striking. A hard hit across her face. "You follow me, bitch." A message, a warning, a lesson meant to break her. But instead of pain, instead of fear, Natalie smiled. Not a mocking smile, not a fearful one, but the kind of smile that sent a chill down Barnes' spine. "If you want to hit me, go ahead." Her voice was soft, yet filled with quiet defiance. "But I won't scream." For the first time in years, Logan Barnes felt something foreign crawl up his spine. Unease. He had broken countless people before. He had beaten them into submission, watched them beg, plead, shatter under his fists. But Natalie? She just stood there. She smiled, her eyes as cold as a predator's, as if this moment, this very confrontation, was something she had anticipated all along. Barnes took a step back. It was barely noticeable, but it happened. Something about this was wrong. Something about her was different. And as he raised his hand again, ready to strike, Natalie remained still, watching, waiting. And deep within her eyes, something flickered. A spark. A warning. And for the first time in a long time, Logan Barnes wondered if this fight was already lost. The silent road. The road was eerily quiet, the only sound being the faint crunch of tires rolling over the asphalt. Logan Barnes, his expression stone cold, gripped the wheel of his patrol car, driving Natalie back to the station after having handled her in his own way. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, never letting her out of his sight. Yet, despite everything, Natalie sat there calm, almost amused, her cold, unwavering smile making him uneasy. This wasn't like the other arrests he had made. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. Barnes pressed the receiver without hesitation, and the voice on the other end sent a chill down even his spine. "Barnes, do you copy?" A deep, emotionless voice, one he knew all too well. A voice belonging to someone untouchable. "Loud and clear, sir." Barnes replied, his usual arrogance replaced with careful obedience. He knew better than to test the patience of the man on the other end. With a single gesture, that voice could erase his career and his life. "Take care of her. Now, she does not leave your hands alive." The words were ice cold, a direct order with no room for interpretation. "We can't let a fish this big keep swimming." The instruction was short, but the weight behind it was immense. Barnes hesitated for a fraction of a second, his grip tightening on the wheel. He had done a lot of dirty work before, but this was something else. Yet, he knew there was no questioning it. There was only one option: follow orders and get the job done. The radio's harsh static faded into silence, but Natalie had already heard everything. She didn't need to say a word. The sharp clarity in her eyes told Barnes she had caught every syllable. She didn't flinch, didn't react, but he knew she understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't an arrest. It was an execution order. And the realization hit her. How many people like Barnes were just pawns in this game? How deep did the corruption run? What was their ultimate goal? Her mind raced, analyzing every word, every clue. This was bigger than revenge, bigger than some petty conspiracy. This was part of something massive, something dark, something that could rewrite the course of her life. And most importantly, she had to act now. The car sped through the empty streets, the low hum of the engine vibrating through the silence. Tension thickened in the air. Natalie knew she couldn't just sit back and let fate decide her end. This wasn't just an arrest. This was a war, and she wasn't going down without a fight. As the car pulled up at the police station gates, she felt it deep in her bones. Something was very, very wrong. The holding cell. Inside the station, there were no ringing phones, no murmur conversations, no shuffling paperwork. Just silence. A heavy, suffocating quiet that felt out of place. It wasn't a normal police station. It was a prison wrapped in shadows, where only darkness thrived. Barnes shoved her into a cold, dimly lit holding cell. Natalie didn't resist, but as her eyes adjusted to the dark, a sharp pain stabbed at her chest, because she wasn't alone. On the other side of the cell, separated by iron bars, sat a man. His face illuminated only by the flickering neon lights above, his expression weary, his eyes clouded with fear. He wasn't a criminal. He didn't have the look of someone who belonged here. But the tension in his face, the dread in his body language, it told her everything. He wasn't just a random prisoner. He was here for a reason. Minutes passed before the silence was broken. A faint sound. A whisper. "Who are you?" His voice was weak, edged with suspicion, but laced with hope. Natalie didn't take her eyes off the wall between them. She was already searching for a way out. She had to, but she still answered, her voice steady. "Natalie Hayes. Arrested for no real reason." "You." A long pause. Then finally a voice, lower this time, hesitant. "Ryan. I'm a witness for a case. A big one." His words were shaky. "But I can't talk about it. If I know I spoke, I'm dead." Natalie's mind clicked into place. He wasn't a suspect. He was a target. And now so was she. She knew exactly what was happening. Ryan wasn't here to be processed. He was here to be silenced. Just like her. And as she pieced it together, a chilling realization dawned on her. Ryan exhaled a shaky breath. Barnes is covering for something bigger. A network. A criminal organization. He's not just corrupt. He's a soldier for something worse. And I've seen enough to know that I won't make it out of here alive. The words hit Natalie like a punch to the gut. Barnes wasn't just a dirty cop. He was part of a machine. A monstrous, unseen empire. And now, she was locked in its cage. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, deep in the darkness of that cold cement cell, Natalie knew she had to escape. Not just to survive, but to burn this entire operation to the ground. But this wouldn't be easy. She would have to fight Barnes. Fight the entire system that had been built to crush people like her. And she would have to do it before they erased her from existence. The war had just begun. Midnight betrayal. The prison cell was suffocating, its silence heavier than the darkness that blanketed it. Midnight had long since fallen, but Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Something, or someone was waiting. She knew this wasn't just an arrest. This was a death sentence, and her enemies were determined to see it through. And just as she suspected, a shadow slithered through the darkness. She didn't have to turn to know someone was there. The faint sound of polished shoes against concrete echoed with an eerie rhythm. Silent, calculated, like a predator closing in on its prey. No loud footsteps, no ridiculous movements, just the quiet, deliberate stillness of something far more dangerous. Then, the door creaked open. A man stepped inside. He wasn't in uniform. No badge, no identification. Just a blank face, cold eyes, and steady hands. Hands that didn't tremble, hands that had done this before. Natalie didn't need an introduction. This wasn't an interrogation. It was an execution. And when his hand slid into his jacket, withdrawing a gleaming knife, she knew there would be no negotiation. He was here to finish the job, predator or prey. But Natalie Hayes was no ordinary target. The moment he lunged, she moved, not with fear, but with precision. Controlled, calculated, deadly. Her hands were cuffed, but that didn't mean she was defenseless. As the blade slashed through the air, Natalie pivoted, twisting her body just enough to evade the strike. And in that same breath, she used the very handcuffs meant to restrain her, looping them around his wrist and yanking him forward with brutal force. Caught off guard, the assassin stumbled, his advantage vanishing in an instant. Natalie seized the moment. Using his own momentum against him, she drove him down to the ground, flipping him onto his back with a bone-crunching impact. The knife clattered to the floor. In one swift move, she twisted his arm, wrenching it behind his back and locking him in place. It had taken less than 5 seconds. And now, he was the one helpless beneath her grip. His eyes widened, shock, disbelief. This was not how the night was supposed to go. Natalie tightened the cuffs, her voice cold. "Thanks for stopping by." He struggled, but she pressed her knee against his back, keeping him pinned. He wasn't a cop. He was a hitman, a pawn in something much larger. And that only confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't just about silencing her. It was about erasing everything she knew before she could expose the truth. She wasn't just dealing with corrupt officers. She was up against something much worse. No more running. Natalie stepped back, watching as the would-be assassin gasped for air on the cold cement floor. She could run, but running wouldn't change anything. Logan Barnes wasn't just a crooked cop. He was part of something deeper, a web of criminals and power-hungry players pulling strings from the shadows. And if Natalie wanted to survive, she had to stop being the hunted. She had to become the hunter. With a sharp breath, she turned toward the hallway. She needed to get out. Now. But as she moved, something or someone appeared ahead. A new player in the game. A woman. Tall, poised, unshaken. She stepped forward with quiet confidence, dressed in a sleek black suit, her hair perfectly styled. But it wasn't her appearance that made Natalie hesitate. It was her timing. She wasn't startled. She had expected this. Looking for an escape? The woman's voice was smooth, calm, unreadable. Natalie recognized her instantly. Olivia Mercer, a powerhouse in the legal world. A woman with connections to people who weren't supposed to be connected. Someone who had worked alongside Logan Barnes. And yet she was here. Now, why? Olivia took another step, her gaze unreadable. "I know you're not the type to go down easy." She glanced briefly at the unconscious man on the floor, then back at Natalie. "Which is why you're going to need my help." The word sent every instinct in Natalie's body into overdrive. Help from her? Natalie didn't trust easily, especially not someone like Olivia Mercer, a woman whose alliances were dangerously unclear. She folded her arms, her expression sharp. "Why the hell would I trust you?" Olivia's lips curved into the faintest smirk. "Because whether you like it or not, I'm her best shot at bringing Barnes and his entire operation down." There was no arrogance in her tone, just certainty. Natalie studied her. Was this a trap? A setup? Or something else entirely? And then Olivia added, "You don't have a lot of options. If you want to survive and expose the truth, you need me. And, trust me, I need you just as much." A beat of silence. Two women standing at the edge of a dangerous game, neither knowing if the other was a piece on the board or a player ready to change the rules. A choice with no easy answer. Natalie exhaled slowly. Olivia wasn't wrong. She couldn't take down Barnes alone. But that didn't mean she would blindly trust her, either. "Fine." Natalie's voice was firm, decisive. "But if you're lying to me, Mercer, you'll regret it." Olivia didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head. "Fair enough." Then she turned and walked down the hall, disappearing into the shadows. Natalie followed. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was war, and she was about to find out exactly what kind of enemy she was truly up against. The reckoning. The day Natalie had been waiting for had finally arrived. She knew she was walking into a brutal legal battle, but that wasn't what unsettled her the most. She had gathered enough evidence to expose Logan Barnes and his criminal network, yet deep down, she understood nothing was ever that simple. Today wasn't about seeking justice. It was about surviving the evil that was hunting her. The armored convoy, transporting Natalie from the holding facility to the courthouse, moved through the city like a slow-moving beast. She sat in the back of a reinforced vehicle, her pulse steady but her mind sharp, scanning every possibility. Then, the silence shattered. A sudden roar of an approaching engine, an explosion tearing through the air. Before anyone could react, masked assassins descended on the convoy like specters, moving with terrifying precision. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was an execution, and their target wasn't her. It was Barnes. Chaos and opportunity. Gunfire erupted. The police escorts barely had time to react before they were overrun. Bullets shattered windows, ricocheting off steel, reducing order to chaos. Natalie hit the floor of the vehicle as glass rained around her, but her mind was working faster than ever. They weren't here to break her free. They were here to silence Barnes. That realization sent a cold jolt down her spine. Someone wanted to erase him before he could talk, which meant one thing. This conspiracy went deeper than even she had imagined. She had to move. Now, in the confusion, her handcuffs had already been removed, a small victory she had won during the earlier scuffle. She seized the moment, using the turmoil as cover. One swift move, and she was out of the armored truck. A masked attacker turned toward her, too slow. Natalie struck first, knocking him off balance, grabbing his weapon before he could react. She wasn't just escaping. She was fighting back. Her eyes locked onto an abandoned black van, one of the attack team's getaway vehicles. Her way out. Without hesitation, she sprinted, yanked open the door, and hotwired the engine. The tires squealed as she launched the van forward. The chase had begun. The hunt begins. Natalie weaved through traffic, gripping the wheel tightly as vehicles swerved. Engines roared, sirens wailed. Behind her, cops, assassins, and Barnes' own men. They were all chasing her. But she wasn't just running. She was chasing something herself. As she pushed the van to its limit, she searched through a stolen phone, snatched from one of the fallen assassins. Inside, a call log. One name stood out. Logan Barnes. Her gut clenched as she played back a recorded conversation. And there it was. A voice, calm, calculating, giving orders. Make sure she never reaches the courtroom. Natalie's grip tightened on the wheel. This wasn't just about Barnes anymore. This was about who Barnes worked for. And she finally had proof. Nowhere to hide. The chase didn't end until she found refuge in an abandoned hideout, a safe house known only to ghosts of the past. She exhaled, gripping the phone, listening to the recording again. It wasn't enough. She needed more. And then, a voice from shadows. Quite the night you've had, Hayes. Natalie's head snapped up, her gun already raised. Olivia Mercer. She stood at the doorway, her black suit pristine, her gaze cool and knowing. She didn't flinch at the gun pointed at her. I assume you have a plan, Olivia said smoothly. But before you get too confident, Barnes isn't as easy to take down as you think. Natalie kept her weapon steady. What do you know? Olivia sighed, stepping further into the room. Barnes has an ace up his sleeve, a secret that could destroy you before you ever get the chance to destroy him. Natalie narrowed her eyes. Spit it out. Olivia hesitated just for a fraction of a second. Your past. A mission. Something buried. Something the FBI would rather the world never know. A chill shot through Natalie's veins. No, not that. She had worked for years to bury that moment, to silence the mistakes, to forget. And yet, Barnes had it. Buried sins, unfinished wars. Olivia's voice was steady, but there was something almost sympathetic in her tone. Barnes has the evidence, Natalie. If he releases it, your name, everything you've worked for, will be erased. You won't just be a rogue agent. You'll be a traitor, a criminal in the eyes of the world. Natalie sat in stunned silence. She had prepared for this fight. She had braced herself for bloodshed, for deception, for betrayals. But not this, because this wasn't just about Barnes anymore. This was about her past, the one mistake she could never take back. She gritted her teeth, pushing the fear aside. She couldn't afford doubt. Not now. So what's your angle, Mercer? She finally asked. Olivia studied her, then gave the smallest of smiles. I can help you win. But you have to understand, Barnes isn't your only enemy. The people protecting him, they don't just want you dead. They want you forgotten. Silence. The weight of the moment pressed down like iron. Finally, Natalie exhaled, steadying herself. She wasn't running anymore. She was taking the fight to them. She met Olivia's gaze with unwavering determination. Then we bring them all down. And with that, the war truly began. The trial of shadows. The courtroom was suffocating with tension, the air thick with the unspoken knowledge that this was no ordinary trial. The harsh glare of overhead lights illuminated every face, highlighting the weight of the moment. Logan Barnes sat in the defendant's seat. His expression was unreadable, cold, detached, like a man who had already calculated every possible outcome. To him, this was nothing more than a formality, a game he had already won. His allies had positioned themselves well. The judge, seated high on the bench, occasionally stole glances at Barnes, a silent understanding passing between them. He wasn't just an impartial figure of justice. He was an accomplice. Barnes had ensured that all the right pieces were in place. All he had to do was play along, and the system would take care of the rest. A reckoning unfolds. Then, it was Natalie's turn. She sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, her gaze sharp, unwavering. To everyone present, she was already a lost cause. A disgraced former agent, a rogue witness fighting against a system that would never allow someone like her to win. But Natalie had something Barnes hadn't accounted for. An ace up her sleeve. The room stilled as she rose to her feet. She didn't rush. She didn't falter. Natalie had waited for this moment, and she was ready. Reaching into her pocket, she produced a small recording device, a simple, unassuming object, yet one that held the power to dismantle everything Barnes had built. The judge shifted in his seat. Barnes' eyes narrowed, and then Natalie pressed play. The death sentence of Barnes. The voice of Logan Barnes filled the room, cold and arrogant. It's time we end this. I can't let her live. If she does, everything I've built will come crashing down. A second voice followed, one of his associates. You're sure we can trust the judge? You said he would protect us. I've arranged everything. Barnes' voice was laced with certainty. With his help, no one will be able to touch us. The courtroom descended into a stunned silence. Natalie let the words sink in. The recording wasn't just proof of Barnes' corruption. It was proof of a criminal network embedded in the justice system itself. The fall of a king. For the first time, Barnes' mask cracked. His hands gripped the table, his eyes darting to the judge, who now looked pale, his once confident demeanor evaporating. Every lawyer, journalist, and bystander in the room sat frozen, watching the facade of power crumble before their eyes. Barnes opened his mouth to deny, to retaliate, to salvage whatever he could. But it was too late. The evidence was undeniable. The system he had thought was unshakable had just been set on fire, and he was burning with it. A last-ditch attempt to cheat fate. Then, the doors to the courtroom swung open. A man in a black suit stepped inside. His presence sent a ripple of unease through the room. He didn't just walk. He commanded the space with his presence. Natalie recognized him immediately. The chief of police, a man more dangerous than Barnes himself. Barnes' eyes lit up, a final, desperate hope. If anyone could stop this, it was him. The chief raised his hand, silencing the murmurs. This trial must be halted immediately. His voice was sharp, authoritative. Barnes is a decorated officer. What you've heard is nothing but an attempt to smear his reputation. The message was clear. This was no longer about justice. This was about power. Barnes was still being protected. Natalie clenched her fists. It wasn't over. The final blow. But before the chief could solidify his authority, a new voice cut through the tension. A federal agent stepped forward from the back of the courtroom. He wore no badge on his chest, only a crisp suit and an expression carved from stone. This case is no longer under your jurisdiction. We've been watching. The evidence goes beyond this courtroom. Logan Barnes isn't just corrupt. He's at the center of a criminal conspiracy, one that stretches far beyond what any of you realize. The chief stiffened. He wasn't used to losing control. And yet, the room was no longer his to command. It belonged to the truth. With a simple nod, the federal agent gave his order. Take them. And just like that, Barnes' world collapsed. The officers who once followed him turned against him. The judge who had stood by his side could do nothing as he was dragged from his seat. The chief of police, silent, powerless, was forced to watch as the empire he had shielded crumbled into dust. Natalie watched it all unfold. The war wasn't over, but the battle today, she had won. The aftermath. As Barnes was led away, his gaze locked on Natalie one last time. There was no longer confidence in his eyes, only fear. She had done what no one else could. She had exposed the darkness. But Natalie knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Because for every Logan Barnes that fell, there was another shadow waiting to take his place. And she would be ready for them. The game has just begun. As Logan Barnes was escorted out of the courtroom, the scene felt almost cinematic, a corrupt officer finally brought to justice. but there was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. His face betrayed no fear, no desperation, just cold, calculated silence. He moved with steady steps down the long hallway, his boots echoing against the polished stone floors. But just before he was shoved into the back of the armored vehicle, he turned. His icy gaze locked on Natalie. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Everyone else faded into the background. The courtroom, the reporters, the spectators, all of them blurred into nothingness. It was just her and him. And then, in a voice devoid of emotion, Barnes spoke. "You think this is a victory?" His tone was almost amused. "The game has just begun." His words hit Natalie like a dagger. She didn't flinch, didn't react, but deep inside, she knew he was right. She had exposed him. She had torn apart the corruption he represented. But Barnes was just one piece of the puzzle. The true puppet masters, the ones who had shielded him, the ones pulling the strings, were still out there, watching, waiting. And now, they knew her name, the shadow of a greater threat. As the police van pulled away, taking Barnes to a maximum security facility, Natalie remained rooted to the spot. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. She knew that somewhere, out in the depths of the political and criminal underworld, there were others. The ones Barnes answered to. The ones who wouldn't let this end so easily. The air felt heavier now, charged with the weight of something much bigger than her. The calm before the storm. That night, Natalie found herself in a small, dimly lit cafe, a rare moment of solitude. The headlines were everywhere. Ex-FBI agent takes down corrupt officer in high-stakes trial. Logan Barnes convicted. But how deep does the corruption go? New wave of investigations set to expose police mafia ties. Her name was now etched into the public consciousness. And that meant she was no longer just a player in the game. She was a target. She scanned the articles, but she felt nothing. No relief, no victory. Only a sinking feeling. She had won this battle. But the war? That was far from over. She took a slow sip of her coffee, forcing herself to enjoy this fleeting moment of normalcy. And then, her phone vibrated. A blocked number. A new player enters the arena. Every nerve in her body went on edge. Years of training screamed at her to ignore it, to walk away. But she couldn't. Her fingers hovered over the screen. And then, she answered. At first, only silence. Then a voice. Low, cold, familiar, yet unfamiliar. "You survived round one, Hayes." A pause. "But are you ready for what comes next?" The line went dead. The screen of her phone black. A single, empty void, like the abyss she had just stepped into. Natalie sat there, motionless, the weight of the words settling over her. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Somewhere, out there in the dark, someone was watching, waiting. And now, they were coming for her. Fade to black. To be continued.